Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you why the Tangzhong method as you know it sucks. Well, sort of. I'm talking about the popular Tangzhong method with the ratio of 1 part flour to 5 parts water that is commonly shared online. Because I think, 1, it's actually confusing something that's very simple, and 2, it has some serious limitations that result in you not being able to get the full benefit from the method. As you'll see later, it's actually crazy how popular this particular Tangzhong method has become despite having no solid basis for the ratio used. So to explain this, you need to know that Tangzhong and the alternative that it's frequently compared to, Yudane, are in essence the same thing. Yudane and Tangzhong are simply the same characters pronounced differently in different languages. In Chinese, Tangzhong, and in Japanese, Yudane. But in English recipes, Yudane is popularly used to refer to a water roux starter made with 1 part flour to 1 part boiling water, and Tangzhong commonly means a water roux starter made in a pan with 1 part flour to 5 parts of water. The difference in the ratio and the way Yudane and Tangzhong are prepared have led many to believe that they are totally different. The thing is, in its country of origin, Japan, Yudane has no such strict conventions of being 1 part flour to 1 part water. Yudane simply refers to the mixture of flour and water heated to produce gelatinized starch with a variety of ratios. Take a look at this paper published in 2015. This section, on the preparation of heat-treated wheat starch, it is reported that Yudane is generally prepared by mixing equal amounts of wheat flour and hot water. However, there is no clear definition of the ratio of wheat flour to hot water, and in fact, various types of Yudane are produced with various mixing ratios. This paper then cites 2 patents and another paper as references to support that statement. One of the patents actually goes as far back as 1999. In this patent, Yudane is made with 100 grams of flour to 80 to 120 grams of water. Other patents or references mention different ratios. The paper then continues on to state that for practical purposes, the Yudane they're using is to be made with the ratio of 1 part flour to 2 parts water, ratio of 1 to 2. An important fact to glean is that obviously we can raise the amount of water so as to make it easier for us to prepare Yudane. So technically, even the popular Tangzhong, with its 1 to 5 flour to water ratio, can be considered as simply another variation of Yudane. We'll get to the science behind this, but first let's move to Taiwan, where the kanji characters pronounced Yudane in Japan are now enunciated as Tangzhong. The Tangzhong method, with its 1 to 5 flour to water ratio, was said to have been spread outside of Japan and Taiwan by a book written by Yudane Chen. Interestingly, I found a very comprehensive master's thesis on Tangzhong written by Ke Yuwen, published in 2004, a year before the recipe book written by Yudane Chen was published. In the section on the definition and the origin of Tangzhong, the paper starts by stating the word Tangzhong is from the Japanese word Yudane, and the Okumoto Flour Milling Company of Japan is quoted as the first company in Japan to publicly use this method, citing a few references published in 2002. So Tangzhong is Yudane. I've mentioned this before in my previous video on this topic in the book by Yudane Chen. She also mentions the origin of Tangzhong is Japan, so there's no doubt about the origin of this method. The 1 to 5 ratio the book introduces is the issue here. That's a lot of water. There has to be a good reason for it, right? But I've looked under the oceans and over the mountains. Not only have I not found out where the number comes from, I've actually found enough reasons to believe that it's a bad idea. So let's start with the last one. Why is it a bad idea? Many research papers on Yudane or Tangzhong prepare the water roux starter with the flour used for the water roux in the range of 10 to 50% of the total flour used in the recipes, obviously based on baker's percentage. Researchers then subject the water roux starter, the doughs, and the final breads to a range of tests using farinographs, extensographs, texture analyzer, colorimeter, and also scanning electron microscope, SEM. From this research, we've learned that Yudane or Tangzhong is best made with the flour content less than 30% of the total flour, and 10% is considered to be the bottom limit. At one time, it was actually made in the range of 5 to 50%. Higher percentages may slightly compromise the appearance and volume of the breads, but substantially enhances the flavor, softness, and the shelf life of the breads. So it is natural for home bakers like us to want to try experimenting within that range. So far, most of the Tangzhong bread I've made have used amounts of flour in the range of 5 to 8% of total flour weight. It's not like they have no effect, it's more like it's not enough Tangzhong. So lately I've pushed my limits to 20%, and I've found it to be superior in taste, softness, and flavor, but the bread does suffer a little when it comes to height and volume, which I'm working on fixing. Videos coming up when I'm done with research, but for now, let's address the immediate problem we face if we try to do this with the common Tangzhong method. How exactly are we going to use 20% of the total flour to make Tangzhong using a 1:5 flour to water ratio? Multiply 20% by 5, we get 100% water hydration. Wow, we've just hit an extreme level of water. Look, if we add it into the final dough, we're going to get ourselves a high hydration dough. And this brings us to a very intriguing question. What is the rationale for the 1:5 ratio? Most researchers use around a 1:1 ratio. 1:2 is also quite common. But 1:5 is way off, and I haven't seen any scientific explanations in the book by Yvonne Chen on this 1:5. Maybe the book is just meant to be a simple recipe book for home bakers, so we're not going to find what we're looking for in there. But in most scientific research, they prefer a ratio with much less water. And here's a fun fact, even young scientists like these 5th graders more than a decade ago knew that 1:5 was way off. Oh, but maybe they didn't know about the book? Oh, they did. Okay, but maybe there's another reason for so much water. Is it beneficial in some other way? So while thinking about it, naturally, a few wild guesses popped up in my mind. Is it to limit the percentage of flour used for Tangzhong or Yudane? Basically limiting the amount of gelatinized starch? Well, that sounds ridiculous. That would mean we'd never get the full benefits of this method, because by limiting ourselves to using less than 10% of the total flour for Tangzhong or Yudane, our recipes will make breads that essentially do not have as much difference with breads made without Yudane or Tangzhong. That can't be it. Researchers have shown there are significant benefits to using 10% and above to somewhere below 30%. Another possibility I thought of is, could the extra water be there to anticipate water evaporation? To be honest, I suspect this 1:5 ratio may have its origins in the kitchen, in the preparation of cooked rice, porridge, and other things like sauces or soups. So basically the starch is slowly heated with a little stirring, which thickens the liquid it's added to. Well, I can imagine doing this using, for example, cornstarch, because the thickening power of cornstarch is more than that of wheat starch. Also, the gelatinization onset temperature for cornstarch is higher, so it may take a little longer for the mixture to gelatinize. The extra water is to anticipate a higher evaporation rate. But for wheat flour, especially to be used in bread, clearly there's no need for that. Okay, but what about the science behind it? So let's have a scientific look at it. If you watched my previous video on this topic, you already know that it starts from starch gelatinization. Starch gelatinization is at the core of the Tangzhong or Yudane method. And as the name implies, it naturally has to do with the starch within the flour that we use for the Tangzhong or Yudane. For gelatinization to happen, our wheat starch has to be soaked in excess water, which is generally considered to be 60% of water content. So 3 parts of water with 2 parts of starch. That makes a 2 to 3 starch to water ratio, weight by weight, considering 14% moisture basis and the fact that starch constitutes on average 68% of wheat flour. 2 to 3 translates to around less than 1:1 ratio of flour to water. This calculation is of course for bread flour. So in essence, 1:1 flour to water ratio is sufficient for starch gelatinization. To have a better insight, let's look at the effect of water on heating wheat starch to water mixture. For percentages of water content greater than or equal to 60%, crystallites within the starch granules melt at around 65 degrees Celsius. Now, this is where it gets interesting. They found that there was not much difference in this critical temperature for the different amounts of water content within the range of 60 to 90%. As long as the water content is above 60%, there's no change in the temperature that leads to this critical phase of starch gelatinization, which makes extra water pretty unnecessary. Actually, there's an older research paper published in 1980 that also indicates the same results. Okay, now let's go back to this Japanese paper we talked about before. Remember, this research is based on a 2-to-1 water-to-flour ratio. These images show the stages of gelatinization as the temperature progresses. Under the microscope in polarized light, the starch granule within the Yudane loses its birefringence and its extinction cross at 65 degrees Celsius and above, a clear indicator for the shrinking of the crystalline regions within the granules, a sign of the completion of gelatinization. From table 1 of this paper, you can also see that at 75 degrees Celsius, the gelatinization is said to be completed. To understand this, we need to know that the starch granule is made up entirely of one type of building block, a simple sugar called glucose. These simple blocks are then linked and densely packed into linear or highly branched polymers known as amylose or amylopectin, respectively. These polymers are then grouped into crystalline and amorphous regions, making starch a semi-crystalline material. When viewed in polarized light under a microscope, starch granules show its birefringence property with its extinction cross. Amylose makes up about 25% of wheat starch, while amylopectin takes up the rest, 75%. In aqueous mediums at low temperatures, 0 to 40 degrees Celsius, starch granules swell due to the diffusion and absorption of water in its amorphous regions, the non-crystalline part. This process is reversible. If you dry it, the swollen granules can still return to their original form. Things change when you bring in more heat. At higher temperatures, starch granules undergo irreversible transformations. The specific changes that happen vary depending on water content. When the water content is lower than 60% weight by weight, that is 2 parts starch to 3 parts of water, it goes through a process called melting. This may require a temperature of over 100 degrees Celsius. But that's obviously not what happens in the preparation of Tangzhong or Yudane, because gelatinization requires the starch to be heated in excess water, a water content of more than or around 60% weight by weight. During gelatinization, the shape and size of starch granules change. They start to absorb more and more water. First, through the amorphous regions, just like before, it causes the granules to swell, after which water starts to get into the dense double helical structures of amylopectin. Heat causes this region to diffuse. That's soon followed by amylose dissolving, and crystallites melting with the consequence of shrinking the crystalline regions. This is when you see the extinction crosses disappear when viewed under a polarized light microscope. More water then penetrates into the granule, making it swell even more. At this stage, some of the amylose molecules leach into the surrounding water, and some of the granules eventually rupture, leading to the rise in the viscosity of the water medium. That's how you get the thickening effect. Alright, that's what happens when it's hot. Once it cools down, though, another process begins. Starch molecules reassociate in an ordered structure through a process that we call retrogradation. 2 separate things happen during retrogradation: the forming of a gel called gelation and the crystallization of amylose and amylopectin. Retrogradation can expel water from the starch network, basically moving water out. When that happens, we call it syneresis. So due to the tight relation between syneresis and retrogradation, we can actually use it to measure the degree of starch retrogradation. Understanding the science behind the gelatinization process is crucial to our understanding of Tangzhong and Yudane, so we can choose how to prepare Tangzhong or Yudane instead of blindly following an unsubstantiated, baseless method despite it being very popular. So this paper strongly shows us that the 1-to-2 ratio is just perfectly fine. And remember this, the ratio as mentioned in the paper was selected out of practicality. All of these, and paired with the fact that the 1-to-5 ratio makes it practically impossible to achieve the recommended percentages as mentioned in many papers, make the Tangzhong with its 1-to-5 ratio a pretty bad choice. In conclusion, I have now completely stopped using the 1-to-5 Tangzhong ratio. So whatever you want to call it, Yudane, Tangzhong, or Wateroo starter, I'm just going to do it this way. Basically, I measure 1 part flour to about 1.5 to 2 parts water by weight. This is more for practical purposes, of course, as I explained before. Any ratio you use above 1 to 1 is just fine. Extra water is just meant to make it easier to prepare the Tangzhong or Yudane compared to the basic 1 to 1 ratio. I bring the water to a boil, pour it into a bowl, slowly dropping in the flour while continuously stirring the mixture. And when it thickens, I keep on folding the dough until I see all the flour has been fully hydrated and gelatinized. And that's it, our Tangzhong or Yudane or water starter is ready. I usually take the extra step of measuring its total weight, and when we deduct this total weight with the weight of the flour used, we get the amount of water within the Tangzhong or Yudane. It can be quite useful for a more precise calculation of the hydration of our final dough, but it's not necessary. So there you have it. Call it Tangzhong, Yudane, or water starter. It is what it is. Okay, before I go, I want to also show you how to easily convert any existing recipe to a recipe using Tangzhong or Yudane. When writing or modifying any recipe, the easiest and widely used method is to use what's known as baker's percentage. In using baker's percentage, we always start with the flour weight, and it is always expressed as 100% in total. Any ingredient after that is expressed as a percentage of the flour weight. For example, take the simple classic white loaf recipe. By applying baker's percentage, this recipe transforms into this flexible format. In this format, we immediately get the hydration of the recipe, that is 70%, which is an indicator of how wet the dough is going to be. And if you want to modify the recipe, let's say you want to use 300 grams of flour, put that number in, multiply it with the relevant percentages for each ingredient, and you immediately get the modified recipe. It's just as easy as that. Now, let's use this basic 101 knowledge to convert this recipe to one using gelatinized starch. Using baker's percentage, it's actually quite straightforward. You start by deciding on the percentage of flour you want to use for the gelatinized starch. Say you want to set aside 10% of the wheat flour for it. So here's the recipe. Easy, isn't it? Another question I get asked often is, do we need to add extra water after this conversion? The short answer is no. Definitely no if the percentage of flour you're using for Tangzhong or Yudane is below 10%. Because at this range, the influence of Tangzhong or Yudane on our final breads is relatively insignificant. If your bread comes out far below your expectations, maybe you should double check the steps you take in the preparation of your Tangzhong or Yudane. I have a longer answer though for percentages above 10%. There's a common misunderstanding that once you make the Tangzhong or Yudane, the gelatinized starch holds onto the water from the beginning of the gelatinization and all the way up to the very end. Some people even speculate that this is what makes the bread moister. This is a bit misguided. The process of starch gelatinization is irreversible, yes, but the water absorption isn't necessarily that way. Actually, there are many ways to get the water out of the gelatinized starch. In the food industry, two methods come to mind: vacuum freeze drying and drum drying. Of course, we can't compare the way we gelatinize Tangzhong or Yudane to the gelatinization process of wheat starch in these two methods. But one thing is clear: gelatinization doesn't mean that the water is permanently retained within the gelatinized starch. At home, when we leave our Tangzhong or Yudane in the fridge, retrogradation, as I explained before, also brings out some of the water content, and further mixing in a stand mixer or by hand kneading will also tear the Tangzhong or Yudane apart and bring out more. So the water absorption is to some extent reversible. The starch granules within our Tangzhong or Yudane, though, have swelled irreversibly. So what exactly happens to the dough when we add Tangzhong into it? From this research paper we referred to before, it concludes that adding Tangzhong or Yudane increases the dough resistance, but the dough ends up having less tolerance to kneading. This is the consequence of adding a pre-gelatinized water roux that has undergone retrogradation into the dough. So will adding more water change this? Yes and no, but it's more important to consider if that's what you really want. Let me explain. Adding water at a glance may help in fixing some of the issues we mentioned above, for example, lowering the dough resistance. But you need to take into account the reduced amount of gluten too, because the part of the protein in the flour that went into the tangzhong or yudane have been denatured, so you have less protein with which to build the gluten network. Depending on the percentage of flour used in your water-roux starter, adding extra water can mean raising the hydration of the bread while having less gluten overall. This is like a situation where you substitute the bread flour in a recipe with a flour of lesser protein content, or maybe this, although not exactly the same, it's like using all-purpose flour in the place of bread flour while adding more water at the same time. And that, I believe, can be like making an entirely different bread. Most of the time, we add extra water to compensate for the loss of water due to evaporation. Also, to anticipate a small part of the water being trapped within the water-roux starter, we may opt to add about 2% more water for every rise of 10% in the percentage of flour used for the water-roux starter, like it's done in this paper. And okay, that's it for today, I guess. That was a lot of information on tangzhong and yudane. Thanks for watching, and bye!